Welcome, everyone. Thank you for being here today, this evening. This webinar is being hosted by IIHS, and we've gathered here today to discuss the book called Cities Rethought, A New Urban Disposition. I'll ask Geeta to take this forward and introduce the authors and start the webinar.
Thank you, Gautam Bhan. Welcome, everyone. Looking forward to the conversation as much as all of you are, I'm sure. I'm so happy the three of our four co-authors are here today of Cities Rethought, New Urban Disposition. Really happy to have Sue here. Sue is Chair of Human Geography at the University of Bristol. Gautam, my colleague at the Indian Institute for Human Settlements, Associate Dean of the School of Human Development. And Michael Keith, who will chair today's conversation. He's the director of the Peak Urban Program back at Oxford. Edgar Peters from the University of Cape Town sends his regrets he's unable to join us today, but he's looking forward to listening in onto the proceedings. So we decided to record this conversation and share it with Edgar right tomorrow. And Michael, Sue, Gautam, Edgar, and a host of others had come together and put together the Shaping Urban Futures online course. Some of you from the course are here today, and we're extending that content into today's conversation. I'm looking forward to listening to the three of you talk about what went behind the book, the research behind it, the practice that emerges from it, and some of the interdisciplinary questions you may have grappled with in the writing of the book. And hopefully, Michael, you'll also talk about some of the pieces that you wanted in the book, but you could not get into it for various reasons. Over to you, Michael.
Right. Thank you very much, Geeta, and thanks to all colleagues in Bangalore for all the fantastic work. We hope that you're enjoying the course. I'm going to be just very brief. We're going to kick off with you doing the course, precisely because some of the dimensions of the course are shared and maybe exemplified in the book itself. So hopefully these two things go together quite closely. Gautam's going to say a fair amount about what the book says and the structure of the book, and then I think Sue will say something, and then I will say something, and then hopefully we'll have a bit of a conversation and open up for some questions. So we'll use up the time, but there will be some time for you to ask us questions. So please engage in the questions as well. Gautam, over to you.
Perfect. Okay, folks, I'm just going to quickly share my screen, and I hope that all of you can see it. Perfect. Okay. So, folks, pleasure to have everyone here. So, on behalf of three of the four of us, I'll take the next 15 minutes just to talk through the structure of the book and a little bit about what went behind us writing it. So, for a lot of us, basically, the book represented a series of moments that we wanted to pick up. Every book is sort of a very personal, intellectual, and political moment in a person's life. So actually, we're kind of putting our cards on the table and telling you a little bit about what made us write it. It's a slightly different book that academics usually write. It isn't an empirical case. It isn't a theoretical framework. We were trying to do something different with it. And that was partly because for the four of us, we sort of felt that the moment that we're all in was something that we were struggling to describe properly. It felt that both in practice, in terms of a larger historical conjuncture, a moment in time, and there felt like this kind of slipping away of language and categories. We were thinking about what it meant, for example, to be able to talk about democracy as a self-evident concept, given the kinds of changes in political representation we're seeing around the world. We were thinking about what it means to think about the idea of human rights or international law, given conflict and attacks and genocide, both, not just in Gaza, but also in Khartoum, also the conflict in Haiti, also the conflict in Mozambique, also the, multiple notions of geographies of violence. We were thinking a little bit also about that a lot of the language we were trained in different generations, the idea of modernity being fundamentally challenged by the Anthropocene, by the questions of climate change, think about futures and futurity and directions towards progress. But the other thing that really drove us to write was a sense of also trying to reconcile the very different roles that we have played in our lives. Between the four of us, we grew up in different continents. We have been urbanists. We have been teachers. We have had a chance to be policymakers. Edgar was central to the drafting of the National Urban Framework for the government of South Africa. Sue's been part of large international policy makings from the IPCC to the International Science Congress. Michael has been part of the state, not even in terms of, not metaphorically, but quite literally as an elected representative in East London. We have been activists in different movements. We have been state actors. I put the E in there because, we've also sort of, in a way, with the play of the idea of being estate actors in different ways. And so some of the questions they were asking actually is that often when we played these roles in our lives, we often felt that we drew on very different kinds of knowledge that in our everyday experience did not feel disjunct, but in the formal knowledge literature felt separate. So what is it that an activist reads or a policymaker reads? What theories help you in one role and not the other? And what is the role of knowledge and thinking behind these different sensibilities? So for us, really, the book was a search for new language, not a search for new theory. There are no new urbanisms on offer. There are no new major frameworks on offer. It was, in a sense, then a counterintuitive moment where we found ourselves as urbanists for a moment actually stepping away from the city as the object of our attention, while being in it all the time. We know very few other ways to argue. And so what we ended up with was the idea of a disposition. And so I'll say briefly what this is. When you think about a disposition, the instinctive sense of it is an idea of a sensibility, a tendency of mind and orientation towards being and understanding the world. And our thought was to think about an urban disposition as a way in which we see, know, and engage with cities. What we see with this disposition will be different for each of us. What the disposition looks like will be different for each of us. That what drew us, in a sense, to the idea of the disposition is that it felt both structurally located, who we are, our identities, our geographies, our biographies shape it, but it was also mutable. It also changed with our experience. It's changed with age and with new questions and new theory and new experiences. And in some ways, we wanted to think about a disposition as a way to say, when we say we should do this, this should happen, who are the I and the we that are these actors? How do we become these actors that can think, analyze, practice in certain ways towards building the horizons that we want? So what this disposition looks like in the book is three things. We wanted centrally to think about thinking. This is very much core to a disposition towards knowledge. We are, in the roles I mentioned earlier, quite invested in doing, and thinking doing is the dialectic we all know, right? Theory, practice with a hyphen in the middle. Though we never quite know what that hyphen is meant to do, and whether it's a bridge or a separation. Good fences make good neighbors, Robert Frost poem coming back. And we wanted to hold a third notion of the idea of feeling, of values, of motivations, of ethics, of politics, and really to bring back in some ways the ethical and political questions within knowledge systems and our relationships to knowledge. We are academics by training, so thinking, doing, feeling felt really good in our notes, but we felt like we had to spice it up a little bit, and they basically became in a sense, before I do that, basically they became a way for us to hold back from three kinds of conditions. We were wary of thinking that was separate from doing, something we've experienced and been guilty of. We were wary of doing that was separate from thinking. And we were wary of thinking or doing that were separate from feeling. And so the real question of the disposition is, how do you hold thinking, feeling, and doing together? And in our language, we call this the normative, the analytical, and the operational. And these three frames are really the essence of the elements of the disposition. As we talk more about them a little bit, I want to emphasize one thing. The three elements of the disposition, they add up in peculiar ways. They are not linear. One does not decide what our normative locations are, then does analytical work that is then operationalized. Though actually for some people, it actually works like that. One may be in the middle of operations and reflect back on analytical underpinnings. One may be in the middle of an analytical problem and realize that one is really motivated normatively towards this in a different way. So for us, the book is written, the chapters follow linearly. It goes normative, analytical, operational. But we say in the introduction, and we actually quite mean it, that we're very happy for readers to start anywhere in the book as long as they complete the circle. And so each of the chapters has a different kind of tenor. But what's important to us is that the three constantly be aligned in some way, in different ways for different people, with different priorities, and different ways for the same people at different points in their life. I think we were reflecting on the fact that through our own trajectories, we have actually arrange these three in slightly different ways in slightly different moments. So what are these three elements? I'll just give them briefly and then hand over to Sue. So the first one is that the way they come together, we argue that an urban disposition must articulate normatively where it begins and what motivates it. I'll come back to this word articulate because it's important for us not to tell folks what the right values are, what the right politics is, what the right ideological location is, what the right faith is. It is actually to say that our work as scholars and practitioners is to reflect and find out what our normative locations are and then make them apparent in our work, so that we're offering it also in a conversation where we can own those locations, our stakes in the ground in some ways, and not in a way pretend, even, for example, in a technical data analysis, that there are no normative political questions that drive that, right? This then links to the idea of to be able to think analytically about how the city actually works and about the nature of complex urban problems. This is probably for academic readers of this book the most familiar. It's about interdisciplinarity, it's about intersectoral work, transscalar work, multidisciplinary work, all these words that we use to talk about complexity. I'll talk a little bit about how we do this, but one of the things we fundamentally wanted to argue is that an urban disposition at this moment needs to have a particular reflection on how it engages with complexity and interconnection. Otherwise, we are left with the two unhelpful binaries of everything is interconnected, but we don't know what to do with that, or we refuse to see connections across silos and remain very tunnel visioned. And what's the way to avoid both of these ends? And we'll offer one way to do that. And the third is to bring back the doing, is to think about how to move operationally to the point on how one could get to different ends. And here again, this is not a book that says do this and not that. It's not best practice, it's not models. It's actually saying, how do we think about what to do? And how is doing as much a site of intellectual theory making as an analysis is, right? So briefly, the way these will, if they come together, then the possibilities are this. Without it, we risk knowledge that is normatively driven, but lacks the analytical rigor to give shape to values, motivations, and beliefs. We can have practice that is operationally very efficient. Think of technological innovations and service delivery in welfare states in the global south, but lacks empathy or value for dignity, or often tries to solve the wrong problem. We can have analytical frameworks that actually leave our understanding incomplete, ironically, by the neatness and singularity of their conceptualizations, right? Now, again, this is not a stand against deep disciplinary or in-depth work that is essential, but there are particular ways in our disposition needs to move between that depth and that sense of moving horizontally and interconnecting. And also to be wary then of analytical frameworks and knowledge that give us very little in terms of knowing how to begin to think about what is to be done operationally. So in 5 more minutes, I'll tell you the 3 elements in some detail. What is the normative? Now, when we think of questions of values, questions of ethics, questions of politics, very often we have a very specific set of forms in mind. An ideological manifesto, a charter, a vision statement, an approach, or an ism. I am feminist, Marxist, left or right wing, right? We have categories. And very often we see, especially in scholarship and practice, that notions of positivism and objectivity have made us basically say that normative locations are often actually wielded as accusations. They're biased, they're ideological, they're subjective, they're irrational, they're emotional. We very much want to speak against this kind of reduction of the normative. We want to own the normative in a different way. What we want to argue is that rather than think about the right politics, we want to make scholars and practitioners using the disposition to make their normative locations apparent, and to do it in a way that doesn't fix us. that particularly doesn't fix us a priori, where we have already decided a value framework that we then deploy, say, analytically, and then risk what my father used to say, that when you hold a hammer in your hand, everything looks like a nail, right? And I think this is one of those ways of thinking about that sense of openness. And the tension here, of course, is that an openness normatively does not mean our values are compromised or weak or we're uncertain, right? And this is the tension that we're trying to think through. And perhaps one of the ways in which also the role of the disposition is not to just make our normative locations apparent, but really find them for ourselves. Often in our own lives and in our writing, we realize that we don't really have the time or the space, and are often not made by the academy or our professional locations to actually reflect to ourselves what our normative locations are. They remain tacit and implicit and unsaid. And we argue this because we're putting our faith in the fact that it is when values are articulated that they can be contested, debated, amplified, and discussed, right? Moves us forward. The form of the normative is really important. So I've mentioned some: a manifesto, a charter, a statement of values, an ethical approach, a position, a location. We suggest a slightly different form for an urban disposition on knowledge. We suggest one way to find your normative locations is to actually articulate them as questions. So basically, in short, that the questions we ask as scholars or as practitioners or as citizens say something about who we are, something about what we value, right? But because they are questions, they are necessarily in exploratory search for shades and nuances of answers. They're not locked in. Not all questions can do this. So some questions that we call dispositional questions are big enough. They stay beyond projects, beyond jobs, beyond the first book, beyond the first paper. They're questions that actually are coterminous in some ways with your life. And in many ways, that the examples, what the book does is that we, four of us collectively offer a set of questions. I won't go into much detail, I'll just list them briefly. The point is not to say these are the right dispositional questions. The point is for every reader to find their own. So here are our five. What is the fabric of the city in distinction with its form? How do you consume deleted futures and thinking about futurity in the Anthropocene? What kind of fight can you pick in the city? Questions of power and resistance. What evidence matters for cities? A distinct question from what is the right evidence to use for cities, or what is evidence-based policymaking? And what is the urbanity of the state? When you read these questions together, in some ways, the very asking of them, we suggest, helps us find our stakes in the ground. The analytical, I'm going to go a bit faster. The analytical is a second part. The analytical argues that in looking at cities, how you know may be as important as what you know. And one step further, how you know something will shape what you think about it. We value forms of analytical redescription, that's the word we're using, that generate knowledge with a certain proximity to practice, but are also ways to untangle complexity, as I said earlier. So we think of it as a knot. Now imagine a knot. The thing about a knot is that you have to know how the threads overlap and entangle, and you know that if you pull one thread, it will tighten the knot, whereas if you open another, it loosens the knot. Knowing how to describe the knot is the kind of analytical redescription that we are suggesting. And our suggestion is that beyond the questions our disciplines or our training offer, we open up our analysis and our ways of looking at the cities and search for what we call puzzles. And puzzles for us are these empirical knots that are the beginning of new theorizations. As the same thing, the puzzles we offer in the second chapter are narratives from across the world. Again, the point is for every reader to find their own puzzles, right? But our puzzles come from East London, about the long changes in a municipal housing estate over a period of decades. They come from Shenzhen and questions of land grab and village action and property making, including a mysteriously moving lychee tree that involves merrymaking with surveyors. They involve a thought of how a community-based program in Durban tries to integrate questions of ecological conservation with community employment generation. They come from Indian cities where patchworks of social protection are thinking about ways of incrementally repairing and building towards a universal system. They come from not just cities, but from interdisciplinary global conferences where knowledge is produced and circulated. And they come from the most aspatial but overly or uber spatial concept of big data, which is nowhere and everywhere at the same time. The last part of the disposition, which is the opposite, operational, is that third chapter then that shifts hats a little bit and talks to us a little bit about what does it mean to wield knowledge within practice. Now, this chapter reads a bit differently from the others, which necessarily so, and many of you who are practitioners may want to start there and work your way back up if that's the way you want to read the book. But for the operational for us, there are 5 parts of what we suggest is essential. One of them is knowing the ecosystem of how a city works, not just how it works on paper, but how it actually works. The second is to be able to have the political intuition to feel what we call the pulse of a moment, to smell the air, to know when some things that were unsayable 5 years ago are sayable now, to sense a political opportunity that can never be fully evidenced, but you know and you feel in some ways in your bone. A way to think about the question of how we know what we are doing is working and when we know what we're doing is working. Really thinking about problems that seem unimaginable today, but we want to occur tomorrow. And we call this building a social imagination, the sense of how one thinks about how do you seed the conditions of possibility to socialize an idea to come and build itself over time. One of the things our disposition is committed to is, in a way, not just work on what is possible in the present, but sow seeds of social imagination for the future. So what is unthinkable now becomes normalized later, right? And really some things that we wish that someone had sat us down with when we were younger and told us, which is how does one build, survive, and live a life of practice? Knowledge frameworks and academic writing can often separate the conceptual with the lived, and we're trying to hold the lived really quite seriously. So in closing, the disposition insists on doing the work to find and articulate a normative position that prefigures both analysis and operations. It asserts the need for newer and fresher modes of analysis that responds to current and emerging urban complexity in ways that can also help us articulate ways of moving. And it takes seriously how to move, work, build, and repair. That is how to operationalize analytical insight towards a fresh normative horizon. We wrote it to be read lightly and quickly. The weight of citation is in the endnotes. We hope that it will reach to a very broad audience like yourselves on this side. And I think, and I'm happy later on if folks want to discuss this after Sue and Michael. I'm particularly pleased at having been able to learn how to put QR codes. So if you're in India, it's the one on the left of your screen. If you're internationally, it's on the right of your screen where the book is available. And we did write the book collectively. So our chapters are not distinct. We didn't write different parts. It is a single text with 4 authors. And I think one of that to us is actually both the reason we came up with the argument, but also in a way us exemplifying what it means to put it in practice. And we can talk more about that in the Q&A. So I'll hand over to Sue now and to Michael to think with this beyond what the book actually says. Over to you, Sue.
Sue.
That's great. Thanks so much. I think that's a really useful overview without giving you any of the details. So lots to get into when you get into the book. And I thought I might just try and say something about why we wrote it in a bit more detail and what that represents. Everybody's read lots of books, and certainly in the kind of academic domain and in the policy domain, they have quite particular genesis. So quite often a book will come out, for example, of a PhD. Some of the best books actually come out of PhDs because they're grounded on really detailed empirical work. It's got a very coherent argument. It's often quite narrow, but generally quite good, especially if it's been well done and recrafted so that it doesn't read like a thesis. It actually makes a really serious contribution as a monograph. And by contrast, quite a lot of the books that I think come out of and are aimed at practitioners have perhaps a slight tendency to self-help or so-called best practice, learning from other places, and they're not unhelpful. So, if you go into senior officials' offices or senior scholars, the shelves will be filled with those, or their computers will be filled with what the equivalent is there. And I think part of the logic of a book is that it has a slightly longer and wider life than just a narrow article or just a blog. In other words, there's something slightly heavier to say, something slightly bigger, maybe something that needs people to be sitting down and reflecting and coming backwards and forwards. And certainly that was the case for us. So this thing of, we, all four of us had been deeply involved in the city business for a number of decades. And for me, what is perhaps most important about the book and what makes it so unusual is that it was absolutely a joint effort. Okay, you see that sometimes in the sciences where different people did different parts of the experiment. This is not that. This is us sitting down to try and reflect, to rethink, to position ourselves, to become a bit more comfortable with our uncomfortableness of what it is that we do and how we may energize ourselves in that task ahead. And I think that for me came through in perhaps at least, I suppose it's those three different ways. Politically, this is just such a complicated moment. So what does it mean to be grounded in the urban experience, which is comes from very divergent points of view? And we don't use the term Southern urbanism. Many of us are deeply embedded in what might be called the Southern, although Michael, I think, was really helpful in bringing us back to the China experience. We had really lived in a whole range of different parts of the world. So we try not to use that language, but we do try and make sure that some of what we say is travels, is not generic, but that has traction in different places. And that to catch yourself, to rethink that is quite difficult and useful to use others as a sounding board. So that was one really valuable thing about the conversation, if you like. But there were two, for me, other more important things, actually. The one is that everybody who was an author had feet in both the academy and in either activism or consultancy or office of some or another kind. And that had changed. So we'd all had various different kinds of roles. And what becomes apparent when you do that is that knowledge is not rooted solely in the academy. In other words, it's not just from universities that we find out what to do and then do it in practice. Or not, our ideology is not necessarily rooted in our religious orientation or our political grouping, but that actually it can be born and grow and be challenged in other places and in other contexts. And perhaps most importantly, the thing that anybody who has done anything in the so-called real world knows is you don't do it alone. And so this thing of kind of what does it mean, not even to work with other people, sometimes to work against other people. What does it mean to position yourself in what can be a context where sometimes you have a lot of power and then that power recedes. Sometimes you've got a particular knowledge that's really helpful. Sometimes you have foresight that others don't have, or a knowledge of history that perhaps others don't have. But how do you know when to speak? How do you know what to bring to that collective? And how do you know how to listen for things that others would bring? And when do you take up and oppose, or when do you actually just allow things to go ahead because they're helpful, if not damaging? So that kind of conversation for us was one that doesn't take place in many books. And we really, really wanted to try and have that, particularly because so many of the urban contexts that we were speaking to were new. They weren't, it wasn't a rollout of formulaic urban management projects. We were aspirational in the sense of saying we'd really like to be involved with city leaders of one kind, whether they were community activist leaders or whether they were the mayors or whether they were treasury people, whoever it was. But so that sense of trying to make a difference, and underpinning that, what does it mean to make a difference? So that question of sort of not questioning ourselves, but wanting to kind of pause and reflect on when you think about knowledge in the context of sometimes called co-production, sometimes called translational research, whatever it is, but we were trying to think, but be even bigger than that. How does it change? And so that thing of stepping back and saying, you no longer think about cities, but you think about how you think. You think about what you need to know, and you think about what do you need to do in cities, through cities, with cities, yes, but not necessarily to advance cities. It may end up advancing the city and the city agenda, but that's not the entry point. So that was a really big motivation. And then the other one, I think all of us have been involved in universities, and there's a tendency to think of universities as research forums. And yes, of course, we have a research background, context, identity, set of activities. But probably the more important part, in a way, of universities is actually teaching. Both undergraduate and postgraduate teaching, and the training of professionals and the training of the next generation. And if you think about the absolute burgeoning of urban knowledge, of urban professionalization, of urban action through the people who have come through in one or another way a higher education system, and you think about how dire an awful lot of what we have taught, what we teach, what we assume is, I think what was really, for me, a really rewarding part of the conversation was this notion that what we do is not unconnected to what we teach. and that in turn has a normative base. And what was our normative base, and how did we surface that, particularly when it was slightly contested? So I think we were kind of able to draw, hopefully, in those ways, in pulling through the book. And I do have to tell you, I felt unbelievably privileged to be part of the cohort of authors, because it was fun. It really was. It was a lot of fun. So yeah, but it didn't draw always on fun. So Michael, maybe I can hand over to you, because I know some of the work that you've done wasn't always fun.
Well, thanks, Sue. And I guess picking up from what Sue said, we all want to make a difference. I think we go places, we look, we see, we think, we act. And Gautam said that one way of making those processes kind of come together in circles is by thinking of them as knots that are puzzles. And one of the ways you play with a puzzle is you twist it and turn it and look at it from different directions. And I'm just going to say a little bit more about that hopefully kind of illustrates this triplicate of not just thinking and doing, but the normative, the analytical, and the operational that comes from this sense of working in a part of London that is historically seen as one of the most broke, the most excluded, the most polarized, areas of concentration of very high levels of poverty. And as in virtually every city in the world, we can go to places of poverty, sites of poverty, and we look, we see, and we want to make a difference. But how we see, how we make that place visible varies. We can think about it as a space where certain things go on and privilege it as a particular space and look at its own internal logics. We can see how that particular place links to other places in the city. We can see how it changes through time. So we can think geographically, we can think historically, we can twist and turn it to look at it, to try and understand what is happening, precisely because we know, one of the things we know is that if you look at the United States, if you look at Europe, if you look at Latin America, you look at India, you look at China, what is common to all is attempts to make place better often have an unintended consequence of actually doing harm to those people that you think you're working for. If one concentrates on the buildings and the infrastructure, then you can make very nice infrastructure by demolishing, by upgrading, by removing some people and inserting others. The place changes. If you think about the people alone without thinking about the urban fabric in which they're set, maybe you can do better by giving them money and them moving somewhere else. But does that do anything for the place itself? So how we think about several things simultaneously is this spirit of the puzzle. And in one case, I'm talking about a small estate in part of East London that was part of an old bombed landscape from 1945. If anyone's seen the Steve McQueen film recently, Blitz, that it kind of illustrates part of that landscape, that the damage from the 39-45 war lasted for decades and decades, and parts of the world, if one thinks of Gaza and other places that Gautam just evinced, that we will see similar things. We know that when people come along and say they want to make a place better, it was in the 1960s, if you excuse me using the N word just once in a very specific way, Black communities in America used to say urban renewal equals nigger removal. It was a voice of that time. And we know that programs of slum upgrading quite often involve moving people on. We know that forms of demolition mean quite often moving people on. And so how we think about these things to make a difference is one part of a puzzle that we look at in the book in terms of trying to improve an estate where there was a landscape that was bomb damaged with lots of kind of fairly appalling quality open space and some stock that was socially owned in the sense it was owned by the local state in terms of its freehold, but much of that stock had been bought out. Margaret Thatcher in the late 70s, early 80s had introduced what she called a right to buy. And some of the poorest communities bought up very poor condition housing that they were allowed to buy what is a leasehold. In other words, the use of the buildings. This is very common to other forms of property ownership, in inverted commas, really, because you have the right to use the property, but the freehold remains, in this case, with the state. What that meant was that lots of the people on that estate had owned their own property, even though the property was in appalling conditions. People used to die on the neighboring estate 10 years earlier than the average in the United Kingdom because the quality of the fabric itself was so poor that respiratory disease was appalling. A series of other public health damages meant that the buildings themselves hurt people. So improving the estate meant partly an issue of trying to improve the buildings. And people locally did not want to see them all knocked down. And because the book illustrates this in one exercise of analytical redescription. That what we tried to do at a time when I was actually part of the state, as Gautam said, but leading with colleagues this particular program of improvement to the estate, we tried to work with people, but that meant not necessarily giving people everything they wanted, but trying to work with people for the longer term in terms of the improvement. What we thought we would be able to do would be able to actually isolate one part of the estate and build a very large tower block, sell it privately, but make sure that all of the money from those sales, all the profit from that piece of real estate was reinvested in the fabric of the estate that was occupied by some of the poorest people in London, largely Bangladeshi. And that program took place, and it was highly contested because people did not want to sell their property, but also under the British regulations, if there are improvements and you own a freehold, you're meant to contribute to any improvement. So there were disputes about who paid for what. But there were also other odd and unintended consequences. The estate was largely occupied by British Bangladeshi families who had come in the late 1960s, early 1970s to fulfill major labor demand in London at the time. And even though they were in these worst forms of housing, they were very often concentrated also in very small flats. And as with almost every single generation of migrants to the United Kingdom, the first generation of British Bangladeshis tend to have 10 to 12 kids, the second generation 4 to 5 kids, the third generation about 1.8 kids per family. It's the same pattern has happened from one wave after another of migrants to the United Kingdom. But what that meant was that in some of those apartments in the estate, you had 12, 13, 14 people living in a 1-bedroom or even most a two bedroom apartment, which meant that there were further problems about communicable disease, further problems about poor behavior within families themselves, issues about learning for the children who had to grow up in those kind of conditions, horrific conditions at times. And one of the things that we had done, rightly or wrongly, was actually have a policy whereby people, where a vacancy became available from a property run by the local council, and it was your next door neighbor and you were overcrowded, you could have what was called a knock-through. So some families managed to get access to 2 or 3, or in some cases 4 adjacent apartments. And what happened at the end of the renewal program was that some of those individuals turned their housing that was a social good, a public good, into property quite logically for private gain. So quite often, those people who had knock-throughs of 2, 3, or 4, in some cases, apartments, actually walled them off and then sold them off individually because they were bought at a discount in British pounds sterling terms. They were tended to be bought for about 20 to 30 pounds each. In the prices of the early 2000s, those apartments sell for somewhere between 250 and 350,000 pounds each. And so in a renovated estate, people had come and gone, and then they had moved on. They hadn't been forced by slum upgrading to move on. They had actually benefited. So there were odd people who won more than others. And some people would say that this was, in a sense, a form of gentrification. And to some extent that is true, but actually the freehold of the property remained with the state. The majority of the housing was still for people who were poorer than others. But it is a complicated picture. It's a complicated tapestry of the buildings and the people together. There are some that win and some that lose. The buildings now have far less respiratory disease. There is far less overcrowding. People who grew up there quite often ended up educationally much better off, physically much better off, and then sometimes moved on. But also the addition of a large tower block meant that some of the small properties that were used for retail were actually occupied by some of the poorer people on the estate who set up their own shops, their own retail that they were able to sell to the rich folk who'd moved inside as well. So it wasn't a straightforward issue of either dispersal and forced removal or straightforwardly the same target group benefiting at the end. It was a much more complicated picture. As you twist the puzzle, you have to work within the operational space that Gautam mentioned earlier on and work through the puzzle and recognize that there are trade-offs, there are winners, there are losers, and the estate still stands. And I think to myself quite often, what failed as much as what succeeded. And I think one of the lessons we talk about in the book is a sense that very often our attempts to improve fail, and we fail again and maybe fail better, hopefully at times. And that's part of the spirit of the book. And so I'll conclude by saying, in terms of what Geeta invited me to do, the bits in the book, I guess, we don't talk about so much, the multiple failures we could talk about. But I guess the spirit of the book as well, which is an urge to everybody taking the course, is to just think about that notion of the puzzle that Gautam evoked early on, to think about how, in order to solve the puzzle, you twist and turn the knot, pull it in different directions, look at it through different lenses, and think it through in terms of both the environment, the urban fabric of the place, the people, the one alongside the other, alongside a set of ethical and moral choices, the normative dimension, that mean there is very rarely a simple solution to a straightforward problem. The world is more complicated than that, but it should not deter us from acting within that world. But hopefully I'm going to shut down now, and maybe, I don't know whether there are questions that people have in the audience. We have some time now for some Q&A. I can't see, please, if you do have questions, type them in the block. While I'm waiting, I don't know whether, Gautam, you'd want to just to come full circle, whether there would be any of your failures that are not in the book that you might want to dwell on for a second while we're waiting for some questions. But
I worked so hard to hide them. Actually, there is a question in the Q&A box. Let me read it out, and then maybe one of us can take it. So the first question here is, thank you for such engaging presentations. Where and how do you reckon knowing interacts with feeling, thinking, and doing? So I can take a first shot at this. So I think for me, one of the ways in which this idea of knowing fits slightly differently with all three of these things. I'll just give you two examples. One of them, for example, is a question of feeling as a kind of knowledge, right? So actually feeling as a point. So there are two examples I want to give. One is when you're faced with a kind of trade-off in practice in a puzzle that Michael just talked about, right? How do you navigate which part of the trade-off are you willing to live with? Right? So how do you think about, so I always used to struggle and say, okay, if there are two options, neither are great, but you have to pick one. What does knowing do to actually making that choice, right? So the analysis really helps you think about, well, what's the fullness of the choice? What happens if I pick this or this, right? The operational part will say how much is doable. I may love one but think it's not operational. I may, the other one, I may pick the one that's more operational, not the one I actually analytically favor, right? But the feeling is really important, because sometimes you make a choice because you are normatively driven with a set of locations where you say, this second choice is not acceptable to me, right? And you don't defend it by other kinds of modes. It's your position. I think a lot of the time, for example, I'll give you a personal example. I grew up as a queer person in India in the 90s. And there were many ways in the early days when we would do a lot of work on knowing, talking to people who were really driven by prejudice. But at that point, we didn't feel like we had a choice. We had to engage whatever publics we had. And also, we used to sort of analyze prejudice as ignorance. They just don't know. And so we would take on the burden of explaining ourselves to people who were questioning our humanity. And it's only later that normatively, at some point in my life, I realized something had changed, because at some point I heard myself say to someone, actually, I'm not going to do that anymore. I'm not going to do that work anymore. It was like a normative location where I'm like, I'm not going to explain. You have to begin at a certain baseline before we work. Now, so I think what's interesting is that was purely driven by feeling. But I also, analytically, it also told me that something had changed in the larger politics of sexuality in India for me to be able to get there. So sometimes for me, feeling is the basis of choice. Sometimes for me, feeling is an instinct, an analytical instinct that something has shifted, right? Sometimes you feel change before you know it or can describe it. So those are the two ways that I put feeling together with thinking, knowing, and doing. Sue, Michael, just anyone?
So how would you think about the knowing fitting with feeling, thinking, and doing yourself?
Well, in a way, I mean, state secrets, and we thought at one point about calling the book "Knowing the City: an Urban Disposition." And the thing which is nice about that is that knowing in the English language is the present continuous tense. In other words, it is something that is iterative. It is something that builds on and works backwards and forwards. It's not a completed task. As opposed to Cities Rethought, which I think was helpful in the sense that it forced us to say, hang on, we are breaking from our tradition and we're trying to step out of how we have always known. But the answer to that is that I think if you look at the title, the first part of the title is about knowing, Rethought, knowing, yeah, : and the second bit is about an urban disposition, in a sense, as an alternative based on that trinity, or that interlocking kind of idea of the normative, the analytical, and the operational. So for me, the knowing thing is it's that sense of intelligence, intellectual intelligence, emotional intelligence, operational intelligence that comes together in the knowing. And as I really would like us, the only thing I don't like about the title is is that it implies a static, and I don't think that is true.
Well, that ties into the next question which Geeta has put online, which I think, Gautam, you might be able to pick up about how we wrote the book. We say we wrote the book jointly, but we didn't split chapters. So so maybe a little bit more about the process and what your thoughts and reactions to it are. Maybe Sue and I can see if our memories are all
the
correspond.
Same.
I mean, you can see what our writing sessions felt like in this webinar, right? I think it's really interesting, right? So the four of us have known each other for some time, and I think that matters. And I think it matters. And I want to be specific about how we know each other, because I think it's one of the arguments we make in the book. We share a kind of intellectual, political friendship and kinship that is not friendship in terms of intimacy, but it's not distinct from it. We are not necessarily personal friends. We are separated by generations. We grew up in different countries. We've had the luck of meeting, each other over a period of time and found a way to understand and speak to each other. But we are by no means folks who have known each other all our lives either, right? I think this is an important thing. And So in the book, we describe these as communities of practice. And I think it's a really important thing for us. We work as a community of practice, which means we have certain normative alignments, but they don't all line up. We are motivated in some ways. We think very differently analytically, which is really exciting. We're not similar in the way we think, but we are always moved for the better, if not in the immediate moment, but soon after, when we encounter the differences in our way of thinking. Our first reaction may not be the most gracious, but our third reaction is pretty good. I think that's out there. But I think that one of the things we were convinced of doing is, and so in the book, we've tried something. We didn't split it, which meant that the text worked in layers. We wrote fragments, put them together. One fragment went from the other person who wrote into it. Like each of these, think of it as an idea of layering, right? Patching one on top of the other. We have not tried to come to a flattened voice where you can't tell us apart, but we've also tried to keep it that you can't quite pick us out individually. And I think it's a really interesting demonstration of this idea of a communities of practice. And anyone who's been part of a political collective or a movement, or even a friend circle, knows the tension between belonging collectively but remaining individual, and how you sort of find that move. So I think what's been really interesting as for us as a writing process is it has been, I think for all of us, an exercise. There's no other way to say it, an exercise in humility. I think we have had to each let go of things. I think we have each had to, we were also trained as people who have written a lot on our own. So we have a sense of the authority of our voice, and we had to realize that wasn't the point. But what we have gained from the layers of each other, right, I think has been really extraordinary. So over a couple of years, we met. We had the fortune of meeting physically and spending some days together, and then we literally wrote, and the text just kept moving between us and layered and layered and layered and layered. There's lots we left out. I also want to say I think it's interesting because we also had to do some shedding of our own anxieties. So we wrote an entire chapter on what the city meant, right? Very academic, full of the literature. And then at some point we were like, that's not the point, right? And we let it go, but at some point, and at the end of it, we had this moment saying, should we bring it back? What if people are like, but what's the city? And then we were like, we just said the city would not be the object of our attention. So there's a lot of anxieties that we definitely thought about. But I think we kept going back to that really normative motivation to write the book, was to write more broadly and to write more reflectively. And Michael has this quote that he brings, I forget whose it's from, he'll correct me, but this idea of saying, to make private problems publicly useful. That was one, I'm paraphrasing it wrong. And this idea of saying that there's something to learn by failing again and failing better. So I think it was there. We also wrote it at a time in our lives where each of us were happy to actually say, let's go shed some of our old skins about the way we thought proper, good, rigorous writing is. And yeah, so I think a very interesting experience, but I agree with Sue. I think even with all the contestations and the disagreements and all of those, it was deeply joyful. And I think it taught us something about that affect and its relationship to knowing. It was deeply joyful. And I think that's something that we're all very grateful for. Right, Michael, or no?
I think what I would add, the one word you didn't mention, I think there, Gautam, was trust, right? This is what I always think of as like a Monday night, Tuesday morning issue, that because we handed our text to each other, quite often you get to Monday night and you look at this beautiful prose that you wrote about 8 hours ago, and some of it has disappeared. It's been erased, as Gautam says. And there's this immediate shock of who has written over and erased my words and my paragraphs. And so you go and stew on Monday night, and then you wake up on Tuesday morning and you look at the same words again and you think, actually, well, maybe they're better, maybe they've gained. And one learns as much about yourself as you do about others by having that moment of trust, I think. But you have to get the bridge between the Monday night feeling and the Tuesday morning feeling in order to do that. But I don't know whether you would say the same, Sue.
So I'm
No, absolutely.
Sorry, so pick that up, but I think the next question I'm going to ask you to lead.
Another one has come. Sorry, and there is.
It's called feeling and thinking are personal and individual, while doing many times is shared. How can one reconcile this?
Maybe I'll take a bash at that. And I think we assume that feeling and thinking are individual. in fact, that probably isn't true. I think quite a lot of feeling is, and our normative positions are ones that come to us from collective experiences, political experiences, educative experiences, religious experiences. I think, and part of what we're trying to say is, if you can step back from yourself to understand where your normative position is, often not a single normative position. I think what for me was very good about the writing process was to realize that I think perhaps slightly different things in different contexts, that what I think now is not what I thought before. I share some things with Michael, I share other values with Gautam, I share other values with Edgar, and some of those are place contingent. So although I think we identify and we own up to the individuality of our normative position, in fact, it generally isn't an individual condition. And similarly, I think we hide behind the fact that doing is collective, but actually, unless you yourself put the effort in, and lots of people put the effort in, nothing happens. So maybe it's a binary that I would question.
Mm-hmm. And I think it's interesting also to put feeling in the context of a knowledge disposition, right? So there's also layers of what we're calling feeling. And I think in many ways, to try and think, when we were starting with it, we were also in conversation in our heads with Bordeaux's idea of disposition, right? Which was always something that was individual, but then also the individual was within social structures, right? It was not so that also that determination. I had a teacher once who very beautifully used to say that the lines between history, biography, and memory are very thin. Right? And I think that's very much the way I think about feeling. It's never only individual. It's always a product of those layers and scales, which is why the ethnographic method believes in its power to abstract from that single interview, that single life, right? So I think so many of those methods. So I would say that as well. I'm going to read the next question as well.
Yeah. But just quickly, Gautam, to add on to that, and I think what we do try and push in the book is that because so much of what we do is in the urban space, the action depends on that of pasts. The built form is there, the historical patterns are there. So while we think we are acting collectively even now, it is not just the contemporary collective that does that.
Yeah. So the question here that we also both of you referenced about southern locations and geography. So one on that, given the geography of urban studies history, urban debates often revolve around Eurocentrism, an issue which it seems to me speaks to the epistemological sensibility of your book. So how do you deal with Eurocentrism in the book? Yeah.
Well, I think we had a choice. We were either going to take it absolutely head on and make it the reference point for the book. But I think what we came to quite quickly, and we in fact did have that conversation quite early on, and we went round quite on a number of occasions. And we certainly had a discomfort with the homogeneity of the concept of the Southern and with the barrenness of where we think that debate had got to. So it wasn't a comfortable place for us to insert into, and to do so would have positioned us within a fairly narrow vein of the urban deliberation more generally, cuts out all the medics, cuts out just lots and lots of things. But the hegemony that you talk about, of course, is absolutely present. And I think some of what we're trying to say is that I don't think we put it in these words, and maybe Michael and Gautam wouldn't agree, but some of what we're saying is that the problem with the way that we think is that it is ill-suited to the contemporary urban, which is, by definition, young, located in places that are not written about, not thought about, and frankly is probably not very good for most of Europe either, and most of North America either. I mean, I'm not terribly sure that even if you were to narrow down the theoretical material that we've come to know as the canon, and you thought about it in the places where it was forged, whether you would think it was fit for purpose. And I think part of what we're trying to say is, even for there, maybe especially for there, it's not good. We've got to think in other ways. And what we've tried to do instead, though, of saying, and if you thought from where we are, you would land up with something different. We've tried to say, can we think about how we think? In ways that might be a bit more flexible. And that's the point of each of the chapters coming up with. These are not the only dispositional questions that are normative. There are lots of ways to redescribe your problem, which are place specific. and we value practice even from bits of Manhattan.
And I think things travel, that we forget at our peril that planners trained in Tongji in Shanghai are building cities in Africa, that there are bankers trained in London and New York who are practicing real estate deals in various parts of Southeast Asia and Latin America. So that things travel that way, but there are globalisms that run at a lower level, at a more grassroots level. You cannot understand London without understanding diasporic connections that are global. You cannot understand East London without seeing what it means for Sheikh Hasina to resign in Bangladesh, for her niece to have to resign as a Minister of State in London, and for diasporic politicians to return home from Sylhet to London because they're threatened with prosecution in Dhaka. So the connections today are promiscuous in a sense. The urbanisms are promiscuous. So I think it is absolutely right to say that the canon is Eurocentric and deeply problematic. But how we then unpack that, I think, needs to think through different imaginaries, smaller cities, less recognized, not just in the global north, but global south alike. I think we're pretty much against a hard barrier. So I think it just remains to wrap up to say, please, one of the things that we may not have mentioned, I think it may have been in the QR codes that Gautam you put on, the book is cheap, so we'd love you to buy it, but you can also download it for free now on various sites, and that means that you can download the book, read it for yourself, and think about how you might write it differently from your own practice, your normative locations, your own analytical puzzles, and your own operational space through which you work. So can I just thank Gautam and Sue, but also Geeta and the team in Bangalore, and also wish all the people who are still doing the course, please stay with us, keep going, and hopefully think about how the book resonates with the course.
Thank you, Michael. And on behalf of all of you, I'll also say we'll be back with more such conversations.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Everyone. Enjoy evenings wherever you are.